Hi guys, welcome back. I really wanted to thank everybody who came to the live lesson last week. It was super fun to see all of your, well, I was gonna say to see all of your faces, but a lot of you guys didn't have your cameras on. But it was really good to have you guys there and to see you guys talking in the chat. It was really awesome. So thank you again for that. So this week we are going to be looking at resources and biodiversity. So far we've been looking at a smaller scale and different populations, how they interact with different things, and how different things would affect the population. This week we're going to kind of zoom out. We're going to look at a bigger picture, and we're going to be looking more at humans and the things that humans have to interact with and things that we as humans deal with. So to survive, we as humans rely on natural resources and healthy ecosystems. So a healthy ecosystem provides us goods and services, things like breathable air, drinkable water. There are wetlands that purify water by filtering it instead of us having to treat the water through a treatment process. Healthy ecosystems also provide plants with medicinal properties, and they provide pollinated crops. But human activities, the things that we do as humans, change the earth. Things like farming and development. And dense populations will produce a lot of waste, and these things can really change the environment, they change the earth as a whole, and they change the resources that we have available to us. So let's get into that. So there are two types of resources. We have renewable resources and we have non-renewable resources. A renewable resource is something that can be produced or replaced. And a non-renewable resource cannot be replenished by natural processes within a reasonable time. So an example of a renewable resource is grass, pine trees, wind, but renewable resources are not always unlimited. They at some point might have a limit that they can't come back from. An example of a non-renewable resource are things like coal, oil, natural gases, things that have been buried and formed over millions of years. So if we use all of those up, they might come back, but it might take another few million years. So we can't plan on using that in our lifetime. A good way for humans to develop and go new places, build new things, is through sustainable development. And this just provides a way for humans to meet their needs without causing long-term harm to the environment. So they use those renewable and non-renewable resources wisely. So for example, if you have a new neighborhood and the builders are building houses, a way for them to develop sustainably would be to leave as many of the trees as possible in that neighborhood. So sustainable development is when there is no long-term harm to things like soil, water, and climate. It consumes as little energy and materials as possible. Whatever you're building can survive environmental stress, so things like weather, and it can help humans improve their lives. Now that we know what a renewable and a non-renewable resource are, we're going to talk about the 5 different types of resources. So the 5 types of resources are freshwater resources, air resources, land resources, forest resources, and fishery resources. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what each of these are and how humans affect them. All right, so the first type of resource we're going to talk about is our freshwater resources. So freshwater is considered a renewable resource, but supplies are limited, and there are sources that are considered non-renewable. So an aquifer is just a source of fresh water, and if you overuse them, they're going to run dry. So even though fresh water itself is a renewable resource, some of these aquifers are non-renewable because you're using more water than the rain is putting in. Only 3% of the water on Earth is fresh water. And of that 3%, we only have access to 1% of fresh water on Earth. Most of it is frozen in polar ice caps and things like that. So we have to make sure when we're using the fresh water, we're not using too much. Another thing that can affect our freshwater resources is pollution. Pollution from industrial agricultural chemicals, so chemicals that people use when farming to keep away bugs, so pesticides and insecticides. Residential sewage, so the sewage from your house goes into a water source and pollutes it. Or factory runoff, so runoff from factories or gas or oil that's washed off of the road by rain can all get into some of those freshwater resources and pollute them. The second resource we're going to talk about are air resources. This is a common resource. It's never used up. Things like wind or air around us. But humans can affect the quality of the air, and it doesn't stay in one place, right? Air moves around. When there's wind, it moves from one place to another. So if there's pollution in the air, it can move from one place to another. So we have pollution from things like smog. So if you're in a big city and there's like a grayish brown haze, that is smog, it's pollution. Acid rain, greenhouse gases, those are all things that can pollute the air. And because of all these pollutants that are in our air, we have recently seen an increase in respiratory illness and in skin disease. And there are excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere from farming and from using up those fossil fuels. The last thing that affects our air is acid rain. So when we burn fossil fuels, it releases chemicals into the air that combine with water vapor and form acids. And then that comes down with the rain, and it can damage or change soil and surface water. The third resource we're going to talk about is land resources. So topsoil is mineral and nutrient rich. It's the top part of the soil that you can grow things in and farm with. So if managed well, topsoil can be a renewable resource, but it's mostly non-renewable because it takes a really long time to form good topsoil. So if you're not managing it correctly, it's going to be non-renewable because it takes so long for that soil to form again. An example of a time that people used up a land resource is the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. So there was large areas across the Great Plains in the United States that were poorly farmed for years and years. And all of the nutrients were being used up, and then a drought hit. So the combination of bad farming over a few years as well as this drought caused soil erosion, and it started to look like a desert. So people started calling this the Dust Bowl. Wind would come through and dust clouds would blow across the area because there was nothing to stop it, because it had been turned into a desert. And this process is called desertification. And right now, 40% of Earth's land is at risk for this if we continue to use our land resources in a way that is not managed well. The fourth resource that we're going to talk about is forest resources. So like with land, these can be renewable when you have well-managed tree farms, but a lot of times it's non-renewable because of deforestation. And deforestation can affect the soil quality. In tropical rainforests, they have really thin topsoil, and after it's cleared out, that soil is only fertile for a few years. There are old growth forests that took centuries to grow, and more than half of them are gone now. And that's an example of when this becomes non-renewable, because this would take centuries for it to grow back, and we don't have that kind of time in our lifetimes for what we're wanting to use this for. The last type of resource we're going to talk about is fishery resources. And like some of the other resource types, these are renewable when managed carefully, but when we overfish, they're non-renewable. And when we look at how pollutants can get into the environment, we look at something called biological magnification. And this is when pollutants magnify as they go up through the food chain. And I'll throw a picture of what that looks like up now too. Some examples of pollutants are things like PCB, DDT, and mercury. And there are some studies with DDT where eagles had their eggshells affected. It made them too thin, so no birds hatched. And because of this, their populations decreased dramatically. DDT is also still used in Africa against malaria mosquitoes. So although it has adverse effects to some of the animals and plants, it's still used because it helps keep harmful organisms away from humans. All right, so now that we've gotten through all of the resources, we're going to talk about something called biodiversity. Biodiversity is the total of all of the genetically based variation in all organisms in the biosphere. And when we look at it, there's three types. So you have ecosystem biodiversity, species biodiversity, and genetic biodiversity. Ecosystem biodiversity is the varieties of habitats, communities, and ecological processes in the biosphere. Species biodiversity is the number of different species in an area or in the biosphere. And a lot of these are single-celled. So most of the species on Earth are single-celled. Genetic biodiversity is the total of all genetic information carried in living things. This one is the most basic, but it's also hard to see. And it's really important for survival and evolution. So why is biodiversity so great? What's so good about it? Why do we need it? Well, there's a few reasons. Number one, it contributes to medicine and agriculture. So there are plants that may have genes that could help with medicine or with agriculture, like there might be a gene for pest resistance. And if we lose that biodiversity, we're going to lose that gene and we won't be able to use it. Another reason is it maintains ecosystem goods and services. So we talked about before keystone species. If we lose those, the whole ecosystem changes. And if we lose diversity in an ecosystem, that could be less valuable to people. Imagine if Hawaii only had one type of fish and a few types of plants. No one wants to go there. So when you have a lot of diversity, it's valuable to people and it brings more people there. The last reason is that it enables organisms and ecosystems to adapt. When you have biodiversity, that leads to the ability to adapt and change over time. So that's why we really need biodiversity and why it's so good. Now that we've mentioned why biodiversity is so important, let's talk about the threats to biodiversity. 99% of all the species that have ever existed are extinct. So extinct species aren't new, but humans are making it worse and accelerating it. Researchers have said that this is the greatest wave of extinctions since the dinosaurs died. So we really have to look at some of the threats to biodiversity, and maybe that could lead to how we can change it and make it better. The first threat to biodiversity are altered habitats, and deforestation and changes of an ecosystem to farmland or housing are examples of this. So when this happens, the number of species that live in that area goes down, and it could even go extinct if you take away all of their habitat. The second threat that we're going to discuss is hunting. So people can hunt animals for all types of different reasons, for meat, for commercial value, body parts, or for sale as pets. And altered habitats leave less hiding places for the hunted animals. So you can really see how some of these threats really go together, and one can make another worse. The third threat that we're going to talk about is introduced species. So if you bring an organism from one place to somewhere else and put it into that environment, it can really quickly grow and outcompete the native species. And when this happens, we call it an invasive species. The fourth threat is pollution, and pollutants can lower biodiversity. Earlier we talked about the DDT that affected the bird eggs. Acid rain can hurt plants and animals, and an increase in CO2 in the air is dissolving in our oceans and making them acidic, and this is destroying coral reefs that are in the oceans. The last threat to biodiversity is climate change. Species are very adapted to their environment. We talked about this in class. So, for example, they're really adapted to the temperature that they live in and the amount of rainfall in the area they live. If this changes, then they will have to move to survive. They'll move somewhere that then has those conditions that they need. But species in altered habitats are affected more by climate change because they don't have anywhere to go. If global temperatures rise as much as predicted, a lot of species are going to go extinct. Now that we've talked about the threats to biodiversity, let's talk about how can we conserve biodiversity. So we can do this by protecting individual species, and zoos and aquariums are great places for this. We can protect habitats and ecosystems, so giving a payment or tax incentive if you have a nature reserve or a protected area, or turning nature reserves into ecotourism attractions. The third thing we can do is enabling neighbors to humans to benefit from conservation. So allowing the animals that live around humans to benefit from our conservation efforts. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me and talking about resources and biodiversity. And I will hopefully see you guys during office hours this week. Bye.